Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started then. So today's session, I'm going to be walking through a spouse client file from start to finish, and it's going to be a really open-ended session. So if you have any questions along the way, just feel free to either unmute yourself and jump in with your question, or you can send it through the Zoom chat if that's easier. So hopefully everybody can see my screen right now. This is the screen that you first get to when you log into the system, and it's going to list all of the clients that you've added in. So we're going to start by adding our first spouse. We're going to go add, and then the key things when entering the details are going to be first name, last name. So if you have the middle name, you can put that in as well. But first name and last name are the key things that you need to have. This email field is if you're going to be sending the client the online questionnaire. So you'd put in their email, you'd click this use questionnaire box, and then when you add them to the system, it will send off an email that gives them a link to their questionnaire. So it basically says, click here to access your questionnaire. So they click on the link. Then they're brought to a page where they have to create a password, just so that their information stays secure and so that they don't have to do it all in one sitting. They can come back and add more information at a later time. And then they're brought right into the questionnaire and they put in their profile, family tree, asset and debt information. And anything they put in that online questionnaire will automatically populate into your system. So it's a really great way to save time on all of that manual data entry. But not all clients are tech savvy, or it just might not be the best option for them. So you don't have to send the questionnaire. You just don't need to fill out the email field, and then just don't click this use questionnaire button. And then you can either use a PDF or Word document questionnaire that you send currently, or you can do it in the actual planning meeting with them from your end. So it's kind of up to you. You have a couple different options. Contributors here at the bottom, this is if you have multiple users on your account and you sort of want to pick and choose who has access to the file. If not, everyone is an administrator on the account. So whoever is marked as the primary contributor here, if you do choose to generate the cover page, that's whose name will come up on the cover page. And you can always change it by picking someone else. So let's go ahead and add Ben. So now Ben's in the system. Because today we're doing a spouse client file, it means we're doing wills for both spouses. We have to add them both as separate clients in the system, and then we can link them together using the spouse client field. So if you've got a situation where you're just acting for one spouse and the other spouse is going to be a beneficiary, you don't need to add them both into the system. You can just add one and then add that spouse to the family tree. But this is if we're doing wills for both of them. Then you need to add them both as clients. We'll go ahead and add that second spouse in. So we'll call her Lauren Collins. And the key trigger here is this little spouse client function. So if you click on it, it's going to bring up all of the other clients in the system who are single. And then you just have to pick who the spouse is from that list. So we're going to pick Ben Collins. And that way they're going to be linked together so that any of their shared family tree or joint asset information will automatically populate in both of their profiles. And then you've also got the option to sync scenarios and appointments so that you don't have to do the same plan twice. You just sync and it kind of copies over everything you've done for one into the other. So if it's a mirror will situation, it can save a lot of time that way. But just remember, you can only do this spouse client thing when you're adding the second spouse to the system, because the first spouse needs to be in the system already in order for you to pick them from that list. So let's go ahead and add Lauren. So now Ben and Lauren are both on our client list. And then you have to choose who you're going to start with. So let's say today I'm going to start with Ben. So you just click on Ben's name and it's going to bring you into his profile. So if the client had filled out that questionnaire, you would see whatever they put in there. So if they build out an extensive family tree, put in all their assets, you would just automatically see it because it automatically populates from the questionnaire. But if not, if you're starting from scratch like we are today, then you'll either just start with the client's icon, or if it's a spouse client file, you'll start with the client and the spouse. So there's a question. In the spouse situation, would you send a questionnaire to each spouse? So you do have that option. You can send it to each spouse, I usually find it easier to just send it to one. So I add the first spouse to the system normally. And then when I'm adding the second spouse to the system, I put in their email and click the use questionnaire box. And then I make sure to do that spouse client function linking. And then when I send it off, that spouse can enter in the information for the both of them because they're linked in the system. So they can even add their spouse's solely owned assets and that stuff as well. But you do have the option to send it to both. It's just whatever you find is best. Good question. But yeah, so this is the family tree section. And usually what I like to do first is edit the client's information. So to do that, you just double click on the icon. So you can click edit and it will edit whoever the blue circle is around, but I usually just double click on the icon that I want to edit, and then it brings up more information. So the key information fields that you're going to want to make sure are filled out for any client are going to be first name, last name, and gender. You're going to want to make sure the correct gender is chosen, just so that the wording of the will comes out properly. If you put in this also known as, so say Ben is also known as Benny Collins, that will come up in the will. Date of birth, you can choose it from this calendar, but I find it easier to just type in month, day, year. So like June 8th. Another question, is the questionnaire available on the system if you want to use it without sending it to a client for completion? So there's no way to sort of generate a PDF form of the questionnaire because it's just tied to the system. It's all electronic and contextual. But what you could do is just go through it with the client like we're doing now. So instead of having them fill out all of their profile information, this is all the same kind of stuff they see in the questionnaire. It's just in a different format. So if they had filled out the questionnaire, then we would be seeing their first name and last name and gender that they had filled out. But if we hadn't sent them the questionnaire, we could do it on our end without having to send the questionnaire to anyone. You could just sit with a client and fill it out this way. But we don't have a PDF questionnaire that you can use if you're not choosing to use the online one. So if you type in the date of birth, let's change that. Let's say June 8th, 1970. That age is going to automatically calculate for you. You can pick the country of birth or the citizenship. You could do multiple. And then all this information, this is good to have on your client. It's recommended by Law Pro, but it doesn't actually have an effect on the will. So this is good for your file, won't affect the generation of the will. The residency is important because however you set the province here is not only how the system knows to calculate the probate tax throughout, but it's also, if you're from BC or Nova Scotia, it's going to generate the BC or Nova Scotian precedent instead of the Ontario precedent, which is the default. So you're going to want to make sure this province here is changed if you're from either of those places. City, let's say Ben's from Toronto. If you type in the city field, it'll say Ben Collins from the city of Toronto in the will. Special circumstances, this is a place where you can note any potential capacity issues. So you would just mark it off and then you could write a description in the box. It doesn't affect the will itself, but it's good to have on your file, especially if you believe there might be capacity issues or will challenge down the line. You want to have that well documented. And then direct relationships. So this is just going to tell you who they're tied to on the family tree. Right now, Lauren is the only other person on the family tree, and Ben is married to Lauren. So that's what that's telling us. And then we'll save that information. Next, say we wanted to add a child. So whoever that blue circle is around is who you're adding to. So if I wanted to add to Lauren, I just click once to get the blue circle around her. Or if I wanted to add to Ben, same thing. Clicking once will get the blue circle around them. And then I go up to the add button and I'm going to say child. And whenever I'm adding a child, it's going to ask me who the other parent is. So is it the current spouse, Lauren? Is it a new parent, so an ex-parent that's going to be involved in the will? Or are they a single parent? So either the ex is not going to be involved in the will or they're genuinely a single parent. So you got those options. Let's just say Lauren. And then you can enter the child's information in. So let's say John Collins, male, date of birth, July 10th, 2000. And then the special circumstances section, for anyone that's not the client, is a place where you can note relationship difficulties, that kind of stuff. Good to have well documented if you suspect maybe there'll be a will challenge or there's something that's not going to be equal in the will. But the most important thing here that does affect the will is this disability tab right here. So if the individual is disabled, you're going to want to make sure this disability function is clicked off, so that later on, if you're trying to draft a Henson trust and you create that trust that's fully discretionary to the death of the beneficiary, then it's going to pick up on the fact that you're gifting it to this disabled beneficiary, and it's going to draft Henson trust wording accordingly. So this is the trigger right here. You want to make sure that's marked off. Then we'll just go ahead and add. So if you look at your add list, you might notice that there's no option for grandchild or niece and nephew, but there's still a way to get them on the family tree. You just have to do it through direct relationships. So instead of adding a grandchild directly to Ben, what you have to do is add a child to Ben and then click on that child's icon and add a child to the child. So let's just say he's a single parent, and that's how you'd get the grandchild in. Same kind of thing for nieces or nephews. What you do is you'd click on Ben, add a sibling to Ben, then click on the sibling's icon, add a child to the sibling, and that's how you get nieces and nephews in. So if there's going to be anybody involved in the will in either a beneficiary or a trustee capacity that doesn't fit on the family tree, either because they're not family or because they're just such distant family that you don't want to build out the family tree just to get to them, you can go over to this other tab and add the person in here. So that way their information is going to be in the system, and later on when you're choosing beneficiaries and appointees, you're going to be able to pick them from the drop-down list. So let's say Jordy's going to be a trustee later on. So we're going to put his information in. Let's say he is a friend, male, and then we'll just add him in. So later on we'll be able to choose him. So that is sort of the family tree section, the people section. But does anyone have any questions so far? Nope, nothing so far. Okay, we'll keep going. So that's people. Next is assets. So with assets, you're always going to start with those general personal effects, just to remind you to gift them to someone in the will. So if you wanted, you could add details, you could put in values, but really it's more of a placeholder to make sure you're gifting it in the initial gift section when we get to the scenarios, so that you're triggering a special general personal effects clause. For any other assets, it kind of depends on your client. So if your client's really high net worth, you want to add in all their assets to sort of see what they have, get a sense of how you're going to plan accordingly, you can do that. If you're dealing with a really sort of simple situation where there's not really many assets, everything is going to really go in residue anyway. You don't need to add all the assets in here. We can just deal with the residue in the scenarios. The one thing you do need to add here are any assets that are going to be specific asset bequests or registered assets that you either want to change or confirm that designation in the will. So let's add a couple assets. Just go to this add button, then you select the type and the category. So let's start with a bank account. So for any asset, that asset name field, that's really the most important, because if you are gifting it as a specific asset bequest, it's going to be how it's referred to in the will, and it's also how it's going to be referred to throughout the system. So if you're adding in like 5 bank accounts and they're all called bank account, that can get kind of confusing. So I changed the asset name to however I want to identify it as. So maybe it's the RBC bank account, whatever that account number is, so that when I'm adding in multiple bank accounts, I can differentiate and know which one I'm dealing with. The balance, you don't have to put values in, but if you do, then the probate tax is going to automatically calculate for you. And then let's just say this ownership is sole. We'll go ahead and add that in. Next, let's go over to real estate and let's add a home. So we'll go home. So again, that asset name, it's going to be how it's referred to in the system. So let's call it the family home. And if you put the address in, that's going to populate in the will if it's a specific asset bequest. We're putting in the value, again, that probate tax is going to automatically calculate for us. But the key thing when adding property is if there's a mortgage on the property, you're going to want to add the value of that mortgage in this field here. So let's say there's like a $50,000 mortgage on it. And that's because it's good to know sort of what asset that debt is associated with. And also it does have an effect on the probate tax. So once we get to the next section, which is debts, you're going to notice that there is an option to add a mortgage in the debt section, but I would add it here if it's associated with a specific asset instead of adding it in the debt section. The one thing, just make sure you're not adding it in this field here and as a separate debt, because then it will double count it and then your kind of numbers will be off. So usually I would just stick to adding it in here if you have the value of that mortgage. Another question. For assets such as a bank account or real property, is there a way to indicate that the client wants to add the beneficiary to title in case of the real property or as a joint holder in the case of a bank account? So you could put that in the detail section right here to note that that's what you're going to want to do to change that asset. Or if you are getting it changed right away and you're like, I know it's going to be joint in like 10 minutes, you can actually change the ownership itself. So you can change it from sole to joint, and then you can add that other joint owner. So if we click right on that line where it says add owner, and we'll pick Lauren, the spouse, then it's going to mark that home as joint between the two. Another place you could put it in is in this notes section up here. So it wouldn't be associated with the specific asset, but it would just be a general note on the file that this specific bank account, it's going to get changed to a joint ownership, that kind of thing. Let's do one more. Let's add an RRSP. So we'll go over here. Again, however you want to identify it as, I would change that asset name. The beneficiary field, this is just whoever the current beneficiary is on the policy. So it's more for information purposes. It doesn't affect the actual planning. So later on, we'll be able to decide whether we want to confirm this beneficiary or do a new designation. This is just information about the current state of the asset. Let's put in the current value. So the probate tax, you're going to notice, always automatically calculates, but the income tax does not. And that's just due to the variability of different clients' tax brackets. So what you have to do if you want the income tax to show is you have to just manually calculate it. And we usually like to estimate on the high end what the client is going to potentially be looking at. So if it's an asset with a capital gain, we would put in something like 25% of that gain. Or if it's something like an RSP, we put in 50% of that. So that way the clients kind of get a sense of the highest possible tax that it could incur, and it's kind of valuable to know how different planning can affect that as well. So let's go ahead and add. Can clients indicate that they want to add a child, for example, to the title of a home as a way of dealing with their estate to avoid probate tax in the questionnaire? So I think that would be probably more of a discussion in the planning meeting itself. There was probably a details field in the questionnaire that the client could indicate that. But I would probably say that that kind of conversation would typically happen in the planning meeting instead of just on their own in the questionnaire. So that's assets. Then we're going to go ahead to debts. So debts works the same way as the asset section. The one thing is make sure we're not adding that mortgage in again because we already added it in to where it was associated with that specific property. But let's say we have to add a credit card. So we're just put in credit card, put in the value, and then there we have it. So the next section is scenarios, and this is really where all of the planning happens. And the idea is that at most you plan for these three scenarios so that your bases are covered no matter what ultimately ends up happening. So what I'm going to show you today is this thing called e-plans. And right now, you could just go through each scenario manually and fill it out the way you want. But if you're dealing with a typical situation, you can go up to this little lightning bolt up in the top corner and look through your list of e-plans and see if any of these are kind of meet what your client's situation is and the kind of planning that they would want to do. So what this does is, depending on which one you choose, it will go out and fill the scenarios and the appointment sections according to what it says in the e-plan. And even if it's not the exact plan that you wanted to do, it's a really great starting point, especially because the surviving spouse scenario is typically going to be everything to the spouse and it will just do it for you. So I'm just going to look spouse with younger children, two distributions trust. So this one is going to give everything to the spouse in the first scenario, everything to the kids in the second scenario in a trust with 50% at 25, the rest at 30, and then in the no descendants, half to siblings, half to spouse's sibling. Let's say I like that idea. Maybe I'm going to change a few details, but I'm going to run it. So I'm going to click on it, click execute, and then it goes through and plans the scenarios and appointments for me. And now I can review the plan. So I'm going to click on surviving spouse. The first section is joint designated assets. So this is any assets that are joint or designated, so falling outside of the estate. And from the assets section, it's going to pull anything we've marked as joint and give it to that right joint owner, which is the spouse in this scenario. And it's also going to pull that designated asset and give it to the spouse here as well too. So this shows us that those are falling outside of the estate. We can even go over to this little summary tab here and show us how much income tax and probate tax we're saving, taking into account spousal rollover and the fact that those assets are falling outside the estate. Then the second one, initial gifts. So this is where you do specific asset bequests or cash legacies. And because we ran that e-plan, it's going to gift those general personal effects to Lauren, which is good. That's what we want to do to trigger that special general personal effects clause coming up in the will. So let's say that we wanted to do it manually. This is how you do it. So it's going to appear over on your list right here. So all you do is drag and drop it over. Then you just click on the beneficiaries line and pick the spouse and then add. So that's how you would do it if you weren't using the e-plan. Another question. When you hold the planning meeting over Zoom, do you typically share your screen with your client and walk through the various sections? Exactly. So usually you start off the meeting going through the profile and assets just to make sure everything they put in their questionnaire is right, and just to check on that kind of information, add in anything they may have missed. And then that's what Jordy does. He shares his screen, goes through each scenario, goes through each asset, and sort of a really visual process, and they really understand what's happening. And that way it's much easier to discuss the specific planning implications of certain decisions and stuff like that when it's visual and right there in front of you. So for sure, that's what it's designed for, is to go through these scenarios, share your screen with the client. In non-COVID times, we just set up sort of a monitor in the boardroom and go through it that way. But in COVID times, we just share our screen like we're doing here and go through it with the client like that. Definitely. So that's initial gifts. And then the last one is balance of the estate. So this is basically how you're dividing up the residue. And because we ran that e-plan, it's going to show us everything is absolutely going to Lauren, 100%. There's no gift over because we'll deal with it in the next scenario. The next scenario is the gift over. So that's good. Surviving spouse looks good. We don't need to make any changes. So then we'll go to descendants only. So probably not any joint or designated assets. The initial gifts will be those general personal effects will be given to the children because we ran that e-plan. So you can name the children specifically, or you can scroll down this list and you're going to get to classes of children. And then you just click like that, and then it will be given to the class. And you can decide later on whether or not you want future children included in that class, and that will be done on the provisions tab. Then lastly, we're going to look at the residue breakdown. So it's got everything going to the children. The duration is when beneficiary reaches age 30. Let's say I want to change that. I want to say 25 instead, and the staged lump sums, I want it to be at 21, they get 25%. So I ran that e-plan, and then I'm just going in and changing the details to match what I actually wanted. So that way I'm not starting from scratch, but I'm still getting the details that I want. And then here's the gift over, first to beneficiaries issue, and then if not, to the other children, the other class members. Perfect. And now because I made a change in this scenario, I want that change to be applied to Lauren's will as well. And so what I can do is basically copy everything I've done in this scenario over to Lauren's profile. And you do that by syncing over here. So make sure you're syncing from the one that you like over to the empty profile, or the one that you want to change, so that it's not overwriting anything you didn't want to change. So press sync, and now everything I've done here is copied over to Lauren as well. The one thing that doesn't copy is solely owned assets, just to note, and the system sees those general personal effects as each of the spouses solely owned assets, so solely owned general personal effect. So sometimes you're going through one, you're gifting their general personal effects, and you're syncing over to the other spouse, but that general personal effects gift is not going to sync over. So you have to go into the other spouses and gift their general personal effects as well. But everything else should copy over. So that's descendants only. If there is an asset, like an investment portfolio, that you want to divide unequally, 50%, 40%, 10% use between the children. So currently you can only divide the asset up equally by creating the gift and just using the class of children or naming those beneficiaries. You can't currently do it that way. One way around it is you could add the asset as 50% of the investment portfolio and then gift that asset to one of the kids, and then 40% of the investment portfolio, or you could just manually change that in the will. So those are kind of the two options for now to do an unequal division of a specific asset. So those are the two scenarios, and then we're going to go to the last one, no descendants. So you don't necessarily always plan for this one, depending on how big the family is, but this is like your ultimate disaster. So the E-plan is going to give it to half to siblings, half to spouses' siblings, but let's say I don't want to do this. I'm going to clear this, and I'm going to start from scratch. So today I'm going to give half to Jordy and half to a charity. So we're going to start with creating a segment. So basically you create segments which divide up the residue, and then you add gifts within those segments, which specify what's happening to that portion of the residue. So we're going to start with segment 1 for 50%, and then we'll add a gift, and we'll pick Jordy. The reason it says 100% is because it's 100% of the 50%. So we're not dividing that 50% segment up even further. So we want to keep it as 100. And then let's say we'll put in a gift over to his issue. So now we've dealt with 100% of this 50%, and we have to go back and create another segment for the other 50%. So we don't want to add a gift because we've already dealt with this segment, but what we want to do is go back to this little grayed out segments here, and then we want to add our second segment. Okay, another question. If there's human reproductive material to consider, where would be the best place to deal with that type of asset? So you can add it as an asset on the assets tab. I believe it's actually a category. And then I would gift it in the initial gift section if you're wanting to do something specific with that reproductive material. It might require a little bit of manual drafting of the clause, depending on what you want to do with it. But that's how you would get it to sort of appear in the system and then show up in the will. So now we've got to create our second 50% segment. So you'd go to this add segment button and segment 2 for 50%, add gift. So if you've already added that charity to the system, you can just scroll down and pick the charity. But if not, you just go to the three dots, go new charity, and then we're going to give it to Epilepsy Toronto. Whatever the CRA number is, you could put that in. Just ignore the ID field. We're getting rid of it. It doesn't do anything. So if you want that number in, put it on the name field. And then we'll go ahead and add. And now we've dealt with 100% of everything, and we can sync this over to Lauren as well. So that's scenarios. Next, we'll go to appointments. So this is where you're going to put in your estate trustees, so your executors, or your guardians if you have minor children. So because we ran that e-plan, it's going to it's going to make Lauren the primary estate trustee. But let's say we wanted to add an alternate. So you go to appointee. Let's say we're going to do Jordy as the alternate. For condition, if you put none, he's going to be a primary. So none will make them a primary. It'll make them a joint primary with Lauren. If we want him to be an alternate, then you play with the condition. So usually I would click if all specified cannot act and make sure the specified is the right person. So that's what I would do, and then add. So it's going to have Lauren. If not Lauren, then Jordy. And so you're really just playing with the condition to determine if they're going to be an alternate to Jordy, if they're going to be joint with Jordy, or if they're going to be a primary with Lauren. And then the sync button for the appointments and the POAs is actually down in the bottom left. So this will copy it over and we'll change Lauren and Ben's name so Lauren's not her own estate trustee. And then the last thing we're going to get to today is provisions. So the provisions tab is the one thing that doesn't sync. So you'll need to go into each profile and do the specifications for each spouse. But the first thing that you can do is the funeral arrangements. So if you have those, then you can just type them on the line and then a body disposition clause will come up in the will. But if not, just get rid of that text and it won't appear. Include future members is if you want future members of that class included in the definition of the will. So for example, for children, it would say my children are John and any other child born to me and Lauren, instead of just saying my children are John. Class restrictions, same kind of thing. Trust for beneficiaries under a certain age. This is your general trust clause. So it's not going to affect any specific trusts you've set up in the will, but it's going to govern underage beneficiaries that you haven't had specific trusts set up for. So like grandchildren. And then the last thing, secondary will assets. These are just if you are doing primary and secondary, so corporate wills, you can pick and choose which definitions you want included in the secondary will. But if you're just doing a single will, you can just ignore it. You don't have to click or unclick any boxes. It won't have any effect. So then before I'm going to generate, I go up to this little exclamation point button. And these are what we call advisor insights. So it's almost like a checklist of contextual advice to make sure you haven't missed any important planning things or that you've considered them. So some of the things are going to be if you've missed something in the system. So I didn't put in Lauren's gender. So it's going to tell me go back and change that before you generate the will, just so that the wording comes out properly. If I did, that advisor alert will go away, but not everything will go away. Some of them, like, is an RESP possible? If you're putting in school-age children, it's going to prompt you on that to see whether they have an RESP, those kind of things. So it's just helpful to make sure you're not missing anything. Then this last button, this is where you generate your documents and your summaries for the client. So I'm going to start with summaries. The first one is the profile summary, and it's going to give you all the information that the clients filled out in their questionnaire or that you filled out for them like we did today. So all of the data on their profile, all of the people in the family tree, assets, debts. I know Jordy usually likes to give this specific summary to the clients after the meeting so that they can check over and make sure that all the spellings of names and all the asset details are correct. Then the second one is the graphic scenario summary. And if you're using values on assets, this can be really nice because it gives you a sort of a visual representation of the will. for each of the scenarios that you filled out. So it's got all the assets at the top and the values there, and then taking into account debts and taxes, initial gifts, and then what you're left with. So it's a nice little funnel. Then the last one is the text scenario summary. So it's going to give you all the information on all of the gifts, all of the residue breakdowns, everything that you've done in the will. So it's just got all the details without the legalese. So it's really useful for the client's kind of true understanding of what's happening with their estate plan. So those are summaries. Then you go to documents. So if you're on a trial, you can just ignore this message. Don't worry about it. But otherwise, if you're on the flex plan, it's kind of telling you that's when the fee will get incurred. So you can add the client, do all of that planning. It's just when you go to generate that first document or summary, that's when it's going to get incurred. So today we're going to do single will. You can change the signing date to a different date if you want. This registered asset designation, this is if you want those registered assets confirmed or to do a new designation in the will. Joint designated asset confirmation, this is if you've got a client that has a lot of joint assets with adult children and you want to confirm that everything's supposed to be joint and not held on a resulting trust. Counterpart execution, it's if you're signing in counterpart under the new legislation. Simplified provisions is a shorter will with less definitions and powers. The will guide is a nice little guide at the end of the will to the clauses in the will, and then a cover page is just a cover page. And then you can pick your witnesses, anybody else who's a user on your account. If not, or if you want to change the witness in the will, just click the white box and then you'll be able to change it in the will. And you can do your affidavits to execution as well. And then you just click on generate and it's going to give you a Word document that's fully editable, just a Word document, so you can make any changes that you want to make. We'll just go through it quickly. So the funds and plans, this is if you click that registered asset box. Assets passing outside of the will, that's if you click that joint asset box. Here's your definitions. My children means John and any other child born to because I clicked that future children box. Here's the appointments, Lauren, if not Lauren, then Jordy. Here's my funeral arrangements clause. Disposition of personal effects. So whenever you give those personal effects to the children in the second scenario, you're going to see this red highlighting. And that's just because you have to make a decision here whether or not you want to leave the division of those personal effects up to the trustee's discretion, or if you want to implement some sort of lottery system or something like that. So you either take out A, B, and C, or you can keep them in depending on what you want to do. Then you've got your residue, everything to Lauren. If not Lauren, this trust for the kids. And then half to Jordy, half to Epilepsy Toronto. And then if I scroll all the way to the bottom, here's my little will guide, which is a guide to the clauses in the will. It can be helpful so that the client can really understand the will. And that's how you'd go through it. Then you would go back, you'd switch over to Lauren's, go through all of her stuff to make sure there's no changes that need to be made, and generate Lauren's documents as well. And just before we go, I want to point out this little question mark button up in the top corner. So if you click on that, it's going to bring you right over to our help desk. And this is where you can search for lots of things on how to do certain things in the system. So if you're like, how do I do a Henson Trust? Then it's going to bring you here to this article and it's going to walk you through it. First, make sure that disability button is marked off on the beneficiary on the family tree. And then when you're creating the gift, make sure you're creating a trust that's fully discretionary and the duration is set to the death of the beneficiary. So this little help desk can be a really great resource. But of course, if you're stuck, you can always email support. You can email me as well. I'm always happy to jump on a Zoom and help you through it. So before we end today, does anyone have any other questions? No? Okay, well, thank you. Thanks everybody so much for joining me, and don't hesitate to reach out if you do have questions. Have a great day.